This webinar will assist you in both understanding and utilizing the RTI process, our framework for tiered instructional and behavior support for student learning. Upon completion of the webinar, the following intended learning outcomes are expected. Be certain to read them carefully. Number 1, I can explain the response to intervention process and the framework for tiered interventions and supports. Number 2, I can justify the use of the RTI process and tiered interventions to support student learning. And number 3, I can complete the appropriate RTI forms to refer a student to Tier 2. Before we move forward, let's be metacognitive for just a moment. Is your classroom driven by clear learning targets? Remember, learning targets are those intended learning outcomes. What are the benefits of having those clear learning targets for you, the teacher, and for your students? As you plan lessons, you are reminded that learning targets are essential to instruction and assessment. As we open, take a moment to reflect on your current knowledge, use, and comfort level of both the RTI process and or the use of the tiered interventions and instructional supports for student learning. Why is each important? What are the steps and or components? Which of these have you been most successful with and why? And what questions do you still have about the response to intervention process and or the instructional supports for student learning? Well, the goal of the response to intervention process is to provide targeted support that will assist all students in being successful academically and behaviorally. This goal is accomplished through a continuous process of monitoring student learning and reflecting on instructional practices. That's right, the use of the data team process. Well, because we will spend a great deal of time discussing the data team process, and because each of you will be continuously utilizing the data team process throughout the year to carefully analyze student data, we will not spend an inordinate amount of time deconstructing the 6-step data team process in this webinar. Rather, in your work session, you will explore how what you may already know about the data team process influences what occurs in the RTI process. We will examine the RTI process in the form of a pyramid of tiered interventions and supports, both academically and behaviorally. Let's begin with Tier 1. Think of Tier 1 as those things you already do in your classroom every day. You design lessons using the best instructional strategies. You assess students to see how well they are mastering content. You provide supports to students who need extra help via tutorial, offering makeup assignments, and so forth. You differentiate instruction. Essentially, Tier 1 of the RTI process is standards-based instruction. Similarly, think of Tier 1 behavior support as those classroom rituals, routines, and procedures, as well as school-wide positive behavior intervention supports that you implement in your classroom. Student learning is continuously monitored, and a big part of that monitoring occurs, you guessed it, utilizing the 6-step data team process. Tier 1 is for all students. However, because there are some students who likely won't be successful with the instruction you provide to the entire class, they need extra support. Well, after considering some guiding questions and analyzing student data with your data team members, you might refer some students to Tier 2 of the RTI process. Here are some guiding questions to consider before doing so. Are you differentiating instruction? Has instruction been modified as a result of benchmark data? Are 80% or more of your students meeting the benchmark expectations? Behaviorally, are 80% of the students following classroom rules, rituals, and procedures? Take a look at the questions to consider along with your analysis of student data before you make that decision. Once you've considered those questions and analyzed student data, you may decide to refer a student utilizing the Tier 2 RTI referral form. You will need to complete and submit the following document to the RTI coordinator, Ms. Hunter. Now, how and why will your student benefit from receiving support through Tier 2 of the RTI process? And what are those Tier 2 interventions that will hopefully assist that student in maximizing his or her learning? Well, in addition to the Tier 1 instruction that students continue to receive, students receiving Tier 2 RTI support benefit from frequent monitoring and measuring of their progress, targeted intervention supports based on their needs, and an additional group of individuals who monitor their learning. In other words, in addition to data teams that continue to monitor that student's progress, Tier 2 supported students also have what we call a RTI problem-solving team, who also monitor learning utilizing a data process. The following form is an example of one of those forms the RTI problem-solving team utilizes to monitor student learning and to document those interventions. Some of those Tier 2 targeted interventions include those instructional focused study skill courses, 21st century, after school grade recovery, and additional online tools designed to be provided in small groups. Now, before we move on to Tier 3, let's check your understanding. Question number 1. What steps must you take prior to referring students to Tier 2 of the RTI process? Question number 2. Why would a student and teacher benefit from referring students to Tier 2 of the RTI process? And then your task. I would like for you to, if possible, print and complete the Tier 2 referral form based on a student that was previously enrolled in your course. And see if you can't complete that referral form based on that data. Now, before we move forward, here's another metacognitive moment here. There's a rule of thumb that says a good driver checks his or her rear mirror every 5 seconds or so. How frequent are you checking for student understanding throughout your lessons? Are you waiting until the end of the lesson to check for understanding? Are you utilizing a variety of assessments and types of questions? Well, as you plan your lessons, intentionally plan for questions that are scaffolded and that move from level 1 to level 3 and 4 questions, in addition to varying your other formative assessments. Now, finally, in addition to the Tier 1 support and Tier 2 support, some students will continue to struggle. These students may need special education services. The data collected in Tier 1 and Tier 2 will be helpful as additional individuals, including district personnel, assist further with the evaluation of these students. Furthermore, additional supports are put in place during Tier 3. They include having, as I mentioned, additional individuals who examine student data and make further recommendations based on students' learning progress. This group forms what we call a student support team. Now, while Tier 4 is part of the RTI pyramid, for our discussion, we will not examine in detail. What you should know is that Tier 4 includes those students who participate in specialized programs and instructional deliveries and benefit from even more frequent monitoring of their learning. Now, let's put this pyramid all together and really get a grasp of the big idea or the overarching theme here. which is data-based decision making. As indicated earlier, we did not discuss the data team process, but I made reference to the process throughout this webinar, partly because the data team process will not only be essential to whether or not Tier 2 of the RTI process is utilized for a particular student, but it will also determine what interventions and supports you will utilize to support student learning. So for that purpose, take a look at the data process. And notice how it's a continuous cycle. As you continuously monitor and evaluate results, you will determine if Tier 2 of the RTI process will benefit students. Similarly, the RTI problem-solving team will continuously monitor Tier 2 and 3 students, measure their progress, and recommend interventions based on need. To make this non-negotiable simpler for you, the following RTI framework and process has been uploaded to the shared drive for your viewing. This, along with the Tier 2 referral document we saw earlier, will also be available in the shared drive. In closing, take a moment to reflect back, and you may do this with a colleague, on the webinar's learning targets. Formulate those targets into questions and answer each of the three. If you can successfully do that, you are that much closer to supporting the learning of all of your students. If you're not able to answer those questions, don't be discouraged. I will simply recommend you for Tier 2 support, a face-to-face professional learning session with me. As verification of your completing this webinar, please submit your check for understanding responses and task to the main office on the designated date and time in the email.